Settle in comfortably and allow yourself to relax. Close your eyes if you wish, or simply let your gaze soften. Tonight, we journey back 4 centuries to the highlands and river valleys of what is now Angola, to a time when kingdoms rose and fell along the trade routes of Central Africa, and when the Atlantic Ocean brought not just salt air and fish, but ships laden with ambition and iron. This is a story about power, not the power of grand palaces or glittering crowns, though those appear here too. It is about the power that comes from understanding your enemy, from bending when you must and striking when you can, from surviving when survival itself seems impossible. It is the story of a woman who was born into royalty, but earned her authority through diplomacy, warfare, and sheer will. Her name was Nzinga Mbande, and for more than 4 decades she stood as a barrier between the Portuguese Empire and the complete subjugation of her people. The Portuguese called her a witch. Her enemies called her ruthless. Her people called her Ngola, the title that would eventually give its name to Angola itself. But before we meet Nzinga, before we witness her diplomatic triumphs and military campaigns, we must first understand the world she was born into. We must walk through the villages and markets, feel the weight of the hoe and the spear, taste the palm wine and cassava meal, and watch as ships with strange white sails begin to appear along the coast with increasing frequency. Let us begin in the Kingdom of Ndongo, in the final years of the 16th century, when the rhythm of life that had persisted for generations was about to be shattered forever. Imagine yourself in the highlands of Ndongo, in a small village, perhaps 2 days' walk from the royal capital of Cabasa. The year is 1582, the same year that Nzinga will be born into the royal family, though of course you, as a farmer or metal worker in this village, would have no way of knowing that distant event. Your day begins before dawn, as it always does. The cool morning air carries the scent of wood smoke from banked fires being coaxed back to life, mingling with the earthy smell of the packed clay floors inside the round houses with their conical thatched roofs. You rise from your sleeping mat, woven from palm fronds, and step outside into the grey pre-dawn light. The village is arranged in a rough circle, with perhaps 30 or 40 dwellings clustered around a central open space. This is where the elders will gather later to settle disputes, where young men will practice their spear work, where women will pound grain in wooden mortars to the rhythmic thud that provides a constant backdrop to village life. Beyond the houses, the land slopes gently down toward fields of sorghum and millet, their stalks swaying in the morning breeze. The climate here is neither desperately hot nor particularly cold. The highland altitude moderates the tropical sun, creating an environment where 2 rainy seasons allow for 2 harvests each year. The soil, though it requires constant tending, is reasonably fertile. Rivers wind through the valleys, their waters flowing eventually toward the great Kwanza River, and beyond that, the Atlantic Ocean that most villagers have never seen and never will. This is a world of iron and agriculture, of kingdoms and trade routes, of complex social hierarchies and ancient spiritual traditions. The Kingdom of Ndongo, where you live, is not a primitive backwater, but rather a sophisticated state with a centralized government, a standing army, tribute systems, and diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms. Your first task of the morning as a farmer is to check on the fields. You take up your hoe, its iron blade a mark of status, for iron is valuable here, carefully smelted from local ore by skilled blacksmiths who learned their craft through years of apprenticeship. The wooden handle is worn smooth by your grip, shaped by the work of countless days that blurred together into seasons and years. The path to the fields is well trodden, winding between acacia trees and past the small shrine where offerings are left for the ancestors. The ancestors are everywhere in your world, not as distant figures, but as present forces who must be consulted, appeased, and honored. They watch over the crops, protect against disease, and ensure the fertility of the land and of women. In the fields you work methodically, loosening the soil around the base of the sorghum plants, pulling weeds that compete for water and nutrients. The work is backbreaking, the hoe rising and falling in a rhythm that becomes almost meditative. The sun climbs higher and sweat begins to trickle down your back, soaking into the simple cloth wrapped around your waist. Women in the neighboring fields sing as they work, their voices carrying across the open space. Songs about harvests and ancestors, about young men going off to war, about the eternal cycle of planting and reaping. By mid-morning, the heat has become intense, and you return to the village for a brief rest and a meal of cassava meal porridge, perhaps with some dried fish or a handful of roasted groundnuts. The cassava is grown in separate gardens closer to the village, a crop introduced from across the Atlantic more than a century ago, now fully integrated into local agriculture. It is starchy, filling, and reliable, though somewhat bland. Your village, like all villages in Ndongo, exists within a complex web of authority. The village chief, appointed by the Ngola through a series of intermediary officials, collects tribute, a portion of each harvest, young men for military service, iron goods, perhaps a few goats or chickens. This tribute flows upward through the hierarchy, supporting the royal court, the army, and the nobility. The system is ancient and, for most people most of the time, it works well enough. There is a kind of social contract here. The Ngola provides protection from external enemies, settles major disputes, performs the rituals that ensure the fertility of the land, and maintains the favor of the ancestors and spirits. In return, the people provide labor, soldiers, and tribute. But there is tension in this system, tension that has been building for the past several decades. The coastal regions, where Portuguese traders have established themselves, have become increasingly autonomous. Some of the Sobas, the regional lords, have begun trading directly with the Portuguese, bypassing the Ngola's authority. They sell slaves captured in raids or warfare in exchange for cloth, firearms, and other European goods. You have heard rumors of this trade, though you have never seen the coast yourself. Traders occasionally pass through the village, bringing news from distant regions. They speak of Portuguese forts built of stone, of men with skin the color of ash, who carry weapons that can kill from a great distance with noise like thunder. They speak of ships larger than any boat on the rivers, ships that carry people away across the ocean to places with strange names. São Tomé, Brazil, the Caribbean, places from which no one ever returns. The Atlantic slave trade by 1582 is already well established, though it has not yet reached the catastrophic scale it will achieve in the coming centuries. The Portuguese have been trading along the African coast for more than 150 years, initially seeking gold and pepper, but increasingly focused on human captives. The slaves come from various sources. Some are prisoners of war, captured in the constant small-scale conflicts between kingdoms and chiefdoms. Some are criminals, sold into slavery as punishment. Some are people captured in raids specifically organized to supply the slave trade. And some, though this is less common in these early years, are simply victims of kidnapping, torn from their villages and families by raiders working on behalf of Portuguese traders. The impact of this trade ripples inland, disrupting the traditional patterns of warfare and diplomacy. Where once conflicts were fought for cattle, land, or tributary rights, now there is an additional incentive. Captives can be sold for European goods. This creates a vicious cycle. Firearms obtained through the slave trade make raids more effective, which produces more captives, which can be exchanged for more firearms. The Kingdom of Ndongo, under the Ngola, has tried to maintain control over this trade, insisting that all dealings with the Portuguese must go through the royal court. But the Portuguese strategy is to bypass the Ngola, to deal directly with subordinate chiefs, to play different factions against each other, to gradually erode the central authority. By the time you finish your day's work in the fields and return to the village in the late afternoon, the sun is beginning its descent toward the western horizon. You wash the day's dirt and sweat from your body with water drawn from the communal well, then join other villagers in the central clearing for the evening meal. The evening meal is a communal affair, with several families gathering together around a large wooden bowl filled with fufu, pounded cassava formed into balls, accompanied by a sauce made from groundnuts and dried greens. You eat with your right hand, pulling off a piece of fufu, dipping it in the sauce, and bringing it to your mouth. Conversation flows around you, talk of the day's work, gossip about marriages and births, speculation about whether the rains will come on time this year. An elder tells a story, one you have heard many times before, but which never grows old. It is about the founding of Ndongo, about the first Angola, who came from the great Kingdom of Congo, far to the north, bringing with him the knowledge of iron working and the proper rituals for honoring the ancestors. The story is long and detailed, filled with episodes you could recite from memory, and the elder's voice rises and falls with practiced rhythm. As darkness fully settles over the village, fires are built up, their light pushing back against the night. The sky above is a vast expanse of stars, uncountable and brilliant without the competing glare of artificial lights. The air cools rapidly, and you wrap a woven cloth around your shoulders. Young people gather to dance and flirt, their movements accompanied by drums and the rhythmic clapping of hands. The drums are made from hollowed logs with animal hides stretched across one end, and the sound they produce is deep and resonant, carrying far beyond the village into the darkness. The rhythms are complex, layered, speaking a language older than words. But even here, in this moment of community and relative peace, there is an undercurrent of anxiety. More young men have been called away to join the Ngola's army. There are rumors of Portuguese movements along the coast, of expeditions pushing inland, of alliances being formed and broken. The world feels less stable than it did when you were a child, as if some fundamental shift is occurring, though its full implications remain unclear. Let us move forward now, several years into your life. The rhythm of planting and harvesting, of rainy seasons and dry seasons, continues. You marry, have children. The village persists, seemingly unchanging, but the distant political tremors are growing stronger. The Portuguese have established a permanent settlement at Luanda on the coast. They call it São Paulo de Luanda, and it serves as the headquarters for their colonial ambitions in the region. From Luanda, Portuguese merchants and soldiers push inland, establishing trading posts, forming alliances with local chiefs, and gradually encroaching on the territories that the Ngola considers his domain. In 1575, the same year Luanda was founded, the Portuguese launched their first major military expedition into the interior. They were seeking silver mines that they believed existed somewhere in the highlands, mines that, in reality, did not exist. But the expedition demonstrated Portuguese military capabilities and their willingness to use force to achieve their objectives. The Portuguese forces were relatively small in number, perhaps a few hundred European soldiers supplemented by African allies and auxiliaries, but they possessed significant advantages. Their firearms, while slow to reload and not always reliable, were psychologically devastating when they worked, producing smoke and noise and death from a distance. Their tactics, developed in centuries of European warfare, emphasized disciplined formations and coordinated movements. And their steel armor and weapons were superior to the iron equivalents available to most African armies. But the Portuguese also had significant disadvantages. They were far from home, operating in unfamiliar terrain, vulnerable to tropical diseases for which they had no immunity. Malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery killed more Portuguese soldiers than combat ever did. They were dependent on long and vulnerable supply lines stretching back to the coast, and their African allies were often unreliable, pursuing their own agendas that might or might not align with Portuguese interests. Imagine it is now 1590. You are older, your children half-grown, and one morning, instead of the usual peaceful beginning to the day, you wake to shouts and the sound of commotion from the center of the village. You rush outside to find a group of warriors from a neighboring chiefdom, armed with spears and bows, driving a line of people bound together with ropes. These captives are thin, exhausted, their eyes hollow with despair. They are slaves, you realize, people being taken to the coast to be sold to the Portuguese. The warriors demand food and water for their captives and themselves. The village chief has no choice but to comply. To refuse would invite retaliation, and your village is too small, too vulnerable to risk conflict with these armed men. You watch as the captives are given water from calabashes, which they drink desperately, water spilling down their chins. They are allowed to sit for a brief rest, though still bound. A woman among them looks to be about your age, and you catch her eye for a moment. In that look is an entire universe of suffering, fear, grief, resignation, a desperate hope that somehow this nightmare will end. But you know, as she perhaps knows, that it will not end well. These people are being taken to Luanda, where they will be held in barracoons, slave pens, until enough captives have been assembled to fill a ship. Then they will be branded with hot irons, chained in the holds of ships, and transported across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that a significant portion will die during the voyage. Those who survive will spend the rest of their lives in brutal labor on sugar plantations in Brazil or tobacco fields in the Caribbean, torn forever from their families, their homes, their world. The warriors finish their rest and drive the captives onward. You watch them disappear down the path toward the south, toward the coast, and a heavy silence settles over the village. Everyone knows that what you witnessed could easily have been your fate instead, that the line between freedom and slavery is thin and largely a matter of chance, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, living in a village that lost a war, being kidnapped by raiders. This is the new reality creeping into your world, a reality where human beings are treated as commodities, where warfare is increasingly motivated by the desire to capture slaves, where the ancient patterns of life are being warped and twisted by the demands of a global trade system centered on the extraction of human labor. In the royal capital of Cabasa, Ndongo and his council are acutely aware of the Portuguese threat. They have attempted multiple strategies to deal with it. They have tried negotiation, sending embassies to Luanda to establish peaceful relations and regulate trade. They have tried military resistance, mobilizing their armies to drive back Portuguese incursions. They have tried playing different European powers against each other, sending missions to the Dutch and even to the Pope in Rome, seeking alternative alliances. But the Portuguese are relentless. They want land for settlement, control over trade routes, and above all, they want access to slaves. The demand for labor in the Portuguese colonies across the Atlantic seems insatiable, and the merchants of Luanda grow rich from the trade in human beings. By the time Nzinga is coming of age in the royal household, the late 1590s and early 1600s, the situation has become dire. The Portuguese have established forts deep in the interior. They have armed their African allies with firearms, creating a network of client chiefs who owe their power to Portuguese support. The Kingdom of Ndongo is being squeezed, its authority challenged, its territory gradually encroached upon. The Ngola, at this time, is Kiluanji, and he faces an impossible situation. If he makes peace with the Portuguese, he must accept their presence in his territory, acknowledge their forts and settlements, and permit the slave trade to continue. But if he goes to war, he risks total defeat. The Portuguese have demonstrated repeatedly that they can defeat larger African armies through superior weapons and tactics. And in the midst of this crisis, a young woman named Nzinga is learning the arts of statecraft, observing the court politics, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of both her own people and their enemies. She is not yet a queen, not yet even particularly prominent in the royal household, but she is watching, learning, preparing, though she cannot know it yet, for the moment when the survival of her people will rest on her shoulders. Let us pause here, in this moment of impending transformation, and consider the texture of daily life in a world being torn apart by forces largely beyond local control. You still wake each morning and go to your fields. The sorghum and millet still need tending. The children still need to be fed. The ancestors still need to be honored with offerings and prayers. The fundamental rhythms of agricultural life continue because they must. People need to eat, regardless of the political crises swirling around them. But everything is shadowed by anxiety. Young men disappear, conscripted into the Ngola's army or into the forces of one of the Portuguese allied chiefs. Villages are raided, their populations carried off. Trade networks are disrupted. The price of iron tools rises because the blacksmiths are being drawn away to make weapons instead. The price of salt rises because the coastal trade is increasingly controlled by the Portuguese. Rumors and counter-rumors swirl. The Portuguese are coming. The Dutch are coming to fight the Portuguese. The Angola is planning a great offensive. The Angola is planning to make peace. In the evenings, around the fires, the elders speak of how things used to be before the ships came. They speak of a time when warfare was less frequent and less devastating, when the social order seemed more stable, when the future felt more predictable. But they also acknowledge that change has always been part of life, that kingdoms have always risen and fallen, that their own ancestors faced crises and somehow persevered. And perhaps, in the back of your mind, you wonder if your children or grandchildren will live to see a time of peace again. Perhaps you offer prayers to the ancestors, asking for protection, for wisdom, for the strength to endure whatever is coming. Because something is coming, the pressure is building, the Portuguese presence is expanding, and soon, very soon, a woman named Nzinga will step onto the stage of history, and the story of resistance will truly begin. But that is for the next chapter of our journey. For now, let yourself rest in this moment, between the old world and the new, between the relatively stable past and the chaotic future. Let the images of village life settle in your mind. The sound of grain being pounded in wooden mortars, the smell of wood smoke and cooking fires, the sight of the stars brilliant in the night sky, the feel of the iron hoe smooth in your hands. The world is changing, but some things endure. The land endures, the people endure, and soon a leader will emerge who will show just how fierce and clever and determined that endurance can be. Let us now turn our attention to the royal compound at Cabasa in the early years of the 17th century. The compound is not a palace in the European sense, no towering stone walls or vaulted halls. Rather, it is a collection of large, well-constructed houses arranged within a palisade, each house serving a different function. The Ngola's residence, houses for his wives and children, meeting halls, storage buildings, quarters for servants and guards. The compound sits on elevated ground, offering views across the surrounding countryside. From here, one can see the patterns of agriculture spreading across the valleys, the neat rectangular fields, the clusters of villages sending up thin columns of smoke, the paths and roads connecting communities to each other and to the capital. It is in this setting that Nzinga Mbande grows from childhood to adulthood. She's born around 1582, though exact dates are uncertain. This is a culture that marks time by seasons and significant events rather than by numbered calendar years. She's a daughter of Angola Kilwanji, which places her in the highest tier of the nobility, but she is not the eldest child, not the heir apparent, not initially someone whose name would be remembered by history. What we know of her early years is fragmentary, filtered through Portuguese accounts written decades later, through oral traditions that were recorded long after the events, through the gaps and silences that always surround the lives of women in historical records. But we can reconstruct something of the education and environment that shaped her. As a royal daughter, Nzinga would have been educated in the arts appropriate to her station. She would have learned the history of her people, the genealogies of the royal family, the proper protocols for court ceremonies. She would have learned about the spiritual world, the ancestors who must be honored, the spirits that inhabit rivers and forests and mountains, the rituals that maintain the cosmic balance. But Nzinga appears to have received more than just the standard education for a royal woman. She was taught military strategy and tactics. She learned to handle weapons, the spear, the bow, the war axe. She participated in hunts, developing the physical skills and endurance required for warfare. This was unusual, though not unprecedented in Central African societies, where some women had always served as warriors and where the boundary between male and female roles was more fluid than in many other cultures. More importantly, Nzinga was present in the council meetings. She observed the diplomatic negotiations, the strategic debates, the careful balancing acts required to maintain royal authority in an increasingly unstable political environment. She watched as her father and, later, her brother struggled to find a path forward in the face of Portuguese expansion. In 1617, Ngola Kiluanji died. The circumstances of his death are unclear, possibly from disease, possibly from wounds received in battle, possibly from assassination. In the succession crisis that followed, Nzinga's brother Mbande emerged as the new Angola. Mbande's reign was troubled from the beginning. He was suspicious, paranoid, prone to violent outbursts. He saw enemies everywhere, real and imagined, and he particularly feared potential rivals from within his own family. According to later accounts, Mbande had Nzinga's son killed, the child thrown into a river, drowned to eliminate a potential threat to the throne. Whether this actually happened or whether it is a later embellishment designed to explain Nzinga's later actions is uncertain. But it speaks to the brutality of royal politics, the way power struggles could tear families apart, the constant fear of assassination or coup that haunted anyone in authority. Nzinga survived her brother's paranoia, but she was politically sidelined, kept away from real power, watched with suspicion. And yet, as Mbande's reign progressed, it became clear that he was not equal to the challenges facing the kingdom. The Portuguese continued their expansion. More territory was lost. More Sobas defected to the Portuguese side. The kingdom was slowly being strangled. By 1621, the situation had become desperate. The Portuguese governor in Luanda, João Correia de Sousa, was pressing hard, demanding tribute, threatening military action, insisting that Mbande acknowledge Portuguese sovereignty. Mbande needed to negotiate, needed to find some way to ease the pressure, but he was trapped. If he went to Luanda himself, he would be showing weakness, placing himself in his enemy's hands. If he sent a subordinate, the Portuguese might see it as an insult, refuse to negotiate seriously. And so, in what must have been either an act of desperation or a stroke of brilliance or both, Mbande turned to his sister. Nzinga would go to Luanda as his representative. She would negotiate with the Portuguese governor. She would attempt to secure peace, or at least a breathing space, for the beleaguered kingdom. Imagine Nzinga preparing for this mission. She is now in her late 30s, no longer young, but in the prime of her life, mature and experienced. She knows that this is the most important diplomatic mission in the kingdom's recent history. She knows that she will be walking into the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by people who see her and her people as inferior, as potential slaves, as obstacles to be overcome or eliminated. The journey from Kabasa to Luanda takes several days, following paths that wind down from the highlands toward the coast. The landscape changes as the elevation drops. the cool highland climate giving way to the humid heat of the coastal lowlands, the forests becoming denser, the air growing thick and heavy. Nzinga travels with a substantial retinue, advisors, guards, servants, drummers and musicians who will perform the ceremonies appropriate to her royal status. This is important. She must arrive in Luanda not as a supplicant begging for mercy, but as the representative of a sovereign power engaging in negotiations between equals. As the party approaches Luanda, the signs of Portuguese presence become more evident. There are African villages that have been converted into Christian settlements, their inhabitants wearing European-style clothing, living in houses built in Portuguese fashion. There are plantations growing crops for export. There are roads wide enough for carts and wagons. And finally, there are the fortifications of Luanda itself. The town of Luanda in 1622 is a modest settlement by European standards, but a significant presence in this region. There is a fort with stone walls and cannon, a church, houses for Portuguese officials and merchants, warehouses for storing trade goods and slaves. The harbour holds ships, the vessels that carry enslaved people across the Atlantic, that bring manufactured goods from Europe, that connect this remote outpost to the vast Portuguese Empire. The population is mixed, a few hundred Portuguese, perhaps 1,000 African residents, and at any given time, hundreds or thousands of enslaved people being held in the barracoons awaiting shipment. The air smells of salt and fish, of human waste and wood smoke, of the tar used to seal ship hulls. The sounds are different from the interior, the Portuguese language being spoken, the creak of ships at anchor, the ringing of church bells marking the hours. Nzinga is granted an audience with Governor Juan Correa de Sousa. The meeting takes place in the governor's residence, a substantial building by local standards, with thick walls and small windows designed to keep out the heat. And here, we arrive at one of the most famous scenes in Nzinga's life, an incident that has been recorded in multiple Portuguese accounts and remembered in African oral tradition, the incident of the human chair. When Nzinga enters the audience chamber, she finds Governor de Sousa seated in a proper European chair, but for her, the Portuguese have provided only a mat on the floor. The message is clear. The governor sits in a position of authority while she must sit below him, literally lower, symbolizing the subordinate position the Portuguese expect her and her people to accept. Nzinga does not sit on the mat. Instead, according to the accounts, she gestures to one of her attendants who immediately drops to hands and knees, forming a human seat. Nzinga sits on her attendant's back, elevating herself to the same height as the governor, maintaining the symbolic equality between their positions. The moment is brilliant in its simplicity. Without words, without confrontation, Nzinga has refused to accept the inferior position the Portuguese tried to impose. She has demonstrated intelligence, quick thinking, and a profound understanding of the symbolic language of power, and she has done it in a way that the Portuguese cannot easily counter. What can they say? That she should not sit on her own servant? That would be absurd. The negotiations that follow are conducted, therefore, between apparent equals. Nzinga speaks through an interpreter. Whether she has learned Portuguese herself at this point is unclear, though she certainly will master the language later. Her position is straightforward. The Kingdom of Ndongo is an independent power. It will engage in trade with the Portuguese. It will maintain peaceful relations, but it will not accept Portuguese sovereignty or the presence of Portuguese forts in its interior territories. The Portuguese position is equally clear. They consider themselves the dominant power in the region. They expect tribute, they expect free trade, they expect the right to build forts wherever they choose. And underlying everything is the slave trade. The Portuguese want unrestricted access to captives, want the African kingdoms to become suppliers in the system of human trafficking. The negotiations extend over several days. Nzinga demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of European diplomacy, of the language of treaties and protocols. She offers concessions. Yes, there can be trade. Yes, the Portuguese can maintain their coastal settlements while holding firm on core issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. During these negotiations, another significant event occurs. Nzinga agrees to be baptized as a Christian. She takes the Christian name Ana de Souza, adopting the governor's surname as was customary for converts in Portuguese territories. Was this conversion genuine? Did Nzinga experience a spiritual transformation, coming to believe in the Christian God? Or was it purely political, a strategic move designed to create a bond with the Portuguese, to demonstrate her willingness to engage with their culture, to make herself and her people seem less foreign, less threatening, less suitable as slaves? The answer, almost certainly, is complex. In Central African societies, religion was not exclusive in the way it was in Christianity. One could honor the Christian God while also maintaining respect for the ancestors and spirits. The spiritual world was large enough to accommodate multiple powers, multiple forces. For Nzinga, baptism was likely both strategic and sincere. Strategic because it served diplomatic purposes. Sincere because she genuinely seems to have engaged with Christian theology and practice, at least at certain points in her life. She would later oscillate between Christianity and traditional beliefs, depending on political circumstances and personal conviction, demonstrating the fluidity that Europeans often found confusing, but which made perfect sense within an African cosmology. The Portuguese, for their part, were delighted by her conversion. Here was a royal woman, a potential future ruler, accepting Christianity. It fit perfectly into their narrative of bringing civilization and salvation to Africa, of the noble work they were supposedly doing, even as they filled their ships with human cargo. The final treaty that emerges from these negotiations is a compromise, satisfying no one fully, but providing a temporary framework for relations between Ndongo and the Portuguese. The Kingdom of Ndongo will engage in trade with the Portuguese. Prisoners of war can be sold as slaves. The Portuguese can maintain their existing settlements. In return, the Portuguese agree, at least in theory, to respect Ndongo's sovereignty, to withdraw from certain interior forts, to cease supporting rebellious Sobas. It is a fragile agreement built on mutual distrust, likely to break down as soon as either side sees advantage in breaking it. But for the moment, it provides breathing space. Mbande can claim to have secured peace without complete submission. The Portuguese can claim to have brought another African kingdom into their sphere of influence. Nzinga departs Luanda having achieved about as much as could be achieved given the severe imbalance of power. She has demonstrated diplomatic skill, cultural adaptability, and personal courage. She has earned the respect even of the Portuguese who negotiated with her. Respect mixed with condescension, certainly, but respect nonetheless. The journey back to the highlands must have given Nzinga time to reflect on what she had seen and learned. She had observed the Portuguese operation up close, their strengths and their weaknesses. She had seen their fortifications, assessed their military capabilities, observed their internal divisions and disagreements. She had also seen the full horror of the slave trade in operation. The barracoons in Luanda held hundreds of people chained together, waiting in despair for the ships that would carry them away. The smell of those holding pens, human waste, disease, death, was overwhelming. The sounds, crying, moaning, the clanking of chains, created a symphony of suffering. This was the reality underlying all the diplomatic niceties, all the talk of trade and treaties and mutual respect. This was what the Portuguese presence meant for ordinary Africans, the constant threat of enslavement, of having your life ripped away from you, of dying in a ship's hold or on a plantation half a world away. And Nzinga knew that the treaty she had negotiated was at best a temporary reprieve. The Portuguese hunger for land and slaves would not be satisfied by any agreement. They would continue to expand, continue to pressure, continued to exploit every advantage. The only question was how to resist, how to survive, how to maintain some degree of independence and dignity in the face of overwhelming force. When Nzinga returned to Cabasa, her brother the Angola received the news of the treaty with mixed feelings. On one hand, war had been averted, at least temporarily. On the other hand, concessions had been made. Portuguese presence in the region had been acknowledged, and the kingdom's position remained precarious. Mbande's paranoia and instability continued to worsen. He made erratic decisions, alienated supporters, failed to implement the terms of the treaty in ways that might have preserved peace. The kingdom drifted, leaderless in any meaningful sense, while the Portuguese gradually consolidated their position. And then, in 1624, Mbande died. The circumstances once again are murky. Some accounts suggest suicide, driven by the despair of his impossible position. Other accounts hint at assassination, possibly orchestrated by Nzinga herself or by other factions at court, who saw him as an obstacle to effective resistance against the Portuguese. What is certain is that Mbande's death created a succession crisis. The throne was empty, the kingdom was under existential threat, and the person with the most experience in dealing with the Portuguese, the most demonstrated political and diplomatic skill, was Nzinga. But Nzinga was a woman, and while women had occasionally served as regents in times of crisis, and while women held significant spiritual and political power in certain contexts, the role of Angola, supreme ruler and military commander, had traditionally been reserved for men. Nzinga would have to navigate this carefully. She would have to claim authority without appearing to simply seize power through force. She would have to demonstrate that she was the legitimate heir, the rightful ruler, the person best positioned to lead the kingdom through its greatest crisis. According to some accounts, Nzinga moved quickly to secure her position. There was a young nephew who might have had a claim to the throne, Mbande's son or another relative. This potential rival died shortly after Mbande, in circumstances that remain unclear. Nzinga's enemies later accused her of having the child killed, eliminating competition just as she claimed Mbande had killed her own son years earlier. Whether this happened or not, Nzinga emerged as the undisputed ruler of Ndongo. She took the title Angola, becoming one of the very few women to hold that position in her own right, rather than as a regent for a male heir. She adopted the full regalia of power, the special ceremonial garments, the royal insignia, the military command. But taking power was one thing, keeping it and using it effectively was another. Nzinga inherited a kingdom in desperate straits. Portuguese forces occupied significant territory. Many Sobas had defected to the Portuguese side or were trying to maintain independence from both the Portuguese and the Angola. The economy was disrupted by constant warfare. The social fabric was torn by the slave trade. The treasury was depleted. The army was demoralized. And the Portuguese, far from respecting the treaty Nzinga had negotiated 2 years earlier, were preparing for a major offensive. A new governor had arrived in Luanda, Fernão de Sousa, cousin of the man Nzinga had negotiated with, and he had no intention of honoring agreements made by his predecessor. He saw the death of Mbande and Nzinga's assumption of power as an opportunity to finally crush Ndongo and establish complete Portuguese control over the interior. Let us pause for a moment and consider Nzinga as she sits in the royal compound at Cabasa, now wearing the full weight of authority, contemplating the challenges before her. She is in her early 40s, mature and experienced, but still physically vigorous. She has spent her entire life preparing for this moment, though she could not have known it. She has learned statecraft from observing her father and brother. She has learned military tactics from her participation in hunts and campaigns. She has learned diplomacy from her mission to Luanda. She has learned about the Portuguese, their strengths, their weaknesses, their culture, their language. But knowledge and skill are not enough. The odds against her are overwhelming. The Portuguese have firearms, steel weapons, stone fortifications. They have access to reinforcements and supplies from across the Atlantic. They have established alliances with numerous African chiefs. They have the momentum of history on their side, the inexorable expansion of European power across the globe. What Nzinga has is intelligence, determination, and a profound understanding of her own people and their capabilities. She knows that conventional warfare against the Portuguese is futile. Their technological advantages are too great. But she also knows that the Portuguese have weaknesses. They are few in number, vulnerable to disease, dependent on long supply lines, and unreliable allies. They can win battles but struggle to control territory. They can defeat armies but cannot subdue populations. And so, Nzinga begins to formulate a strategy, one that will combine conventional military resistance with guerrilla warfare, diplomatic maneuvering with strategic retreats, alliances with anyone willing to fight the Portuguese regardless of their other characteristics. It will be a long struggle, a war of attrition, requiring patience and flexibility, and the willingness to do whatever is necessary for survival. In the months following her assumption of power, Nzinga attempts to shore up her position. She sends embassies to neighboring kingdoms, seeking alliances. She works to reconcile with Sobas, who had broken away from royal authority, offering pardons and gifts in exchange for renewed loyalty. She reorganizes the army, appointing capable commanders, acquiring what firearms she can through trade or capture. She also sends another embassy to Luanda, hoping to negotiate with the new governor to perhaps extend the fragile peace. But Governor Fernão de Sousa is not interested in negotiation. He demands complete submission, and Nzinga must acknowledge Portuguese sovereignty, pay tribute, allow Portuguese forces free passage through her territory, and supply slaves for the Atlantic trade. These are terms Nzinga cannot accept without effectively surrendering her kingdom's independence. And so the diplomatic efforts fail. The Portuguese prepare their offensive. Nzinga prepares her defense. And the stage is set for the military confrontation that will define her reign and her legacy. A confrontation that will last not months or years, but decades, that will transform Nzinga from a clever diplomat into a legendary warrior queen, that will demonstrate the fierce determination of a people refusing to submit to conquest and enslavement. But warfare, as Nzinga knows, is not just about battles and military tactics. It is about logistics, alliances, morale, strategy. It is about knowing when to fight and when to retreat, when to negotiate, and when to resist. It is about survival, not glory. And in the long struggle ahead, Nzinga will demonstrate a mastery of these arts that will earn her a place among history's most remarkable military leaders. The evening is growing late. In the royal compound at Cabasa, fires are lit against the darkness. Guards patrol the palisade, watchful for any signs of Portuguese movement. In the houses, families gather for their evening meals, their conversations subdued, everyone aware that war is coming, that the relatively peaceful world of their parents and grandparents is gone forever. And in the central house, Nzinga sits with her advisors, studying reports from scouts, planning defensive positions, considering strategies. She does not sleep much these days. There is too much to do, too much at stake. The weight of her people's survival rests on her shoulders, and she bears it with a determination that will not waver, cannot waver, for there is no one else to carry this burden. The night deepens. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath them. And somewhere to the west, in Luanda, Portuguese commanders are also sitting in late-night meetings, also planning, also preparing for the war that both sides know is inevitable. The war began in earnest in 1626, though its opening moves had been unfolding for months in the form of raids, counter-raids, and the steady Portuguese advance into the interior. Governor Fernão de Sousa assembled a substantial force, Several hundred Portuguese soldiers, supplemented by thousands of African auxiliaries drawn from allied chiefs and from enslaved warriors who fought in exchange for promises of freedom or simply because they had no choice. The Portuguese strategy was straightforward. Capture or destroy Cabaça, eliminate Nzinga as a political force, install a puppet ruler who would be compliant with Portuguese demands, and open the interior fully to Portuguese control and the slave trade. It was a strategy that had worked elsewhere in Africa and in Portuguese colonies around the world: decapitate the indigenous leadership, co-opt or destroy local power structures, and establish colonial administration. Nzinga's forces, by contrast, were less well equipped. They had some firearms, obtained through trade or captured in previous skirmishes, but not enough to match the Portuguese firepower. The majority of her warriors fought with traditional weapons: spears, bows, war axes, shields made of leather or woven reeds. What they had in abundance was knowledge of the terrain, the support of the local population, and a leader who understood that this was not a war that could be won through conventional means. The Portuguese advance was methodical. They moved inland from their coastal bases, establishing fortified positions, burning villages that resisted, accepting the submission of chiefs who offered it. The landscape they passed through bore the scars of previous conflicts: abandoned settlements, fields gone to seed, forests reclaiming land that had once been cultivated. Nzinga's first major decision was whether to defend Cabaça or to abandon the capital and wage a mobile campaign. The capital had symbolic importance. It was the seat of royal power, the place where the ancestors were honored, the center of the kingdom. To abandon it would be to acknowledge defeat, to undermine her legitimacy as Angola. But to defend it against a Portuguese siege would be to invite disaster. The Portuguese excelled at siege warfare. They had cannon that could batter down fortifications. They had the discipline to maintain a siege for months if necessary. And once Nzinga's forces were trapped inside defensive walls, they would lose the mobility that was their greatest advantage. Nzinga chose a middle path. She would defend Cabaça, but not to the last. She would make the Portuguese pay for their advance, slow them down, inflict casualties, but preserve her army for the longer struggle ahead. When the situation became untenable, she would withdraw, keeping her forces intact. The Portuguese approached Cabaça in the dry season of 1626, when the lack of rain made movement easier, but also made water supplies more vulnerable to disruption. Nzinga had prepared defensive positions on the approaches to the capital: earthworks, obstacles, positions where her archers could harass the Portuguese advance. The fighting that followed was not the dramatic clash of armies that makes for exciting storytelling. Instead, it was a grinding series of skirmishes and engagements. Portuguese forces would advance to a defensive position. Nzinga's warriors would resist, inflicting what casualties they could, then fall back to the next position. The Portuguese would consolidate their gains, bring up supplies, and prepare for the next advance. The casualties mounted slowly. Men died from musket balls and arrow wounds, from infected injuries in an age before antibiotics, from disease that spread through military camps where sanitation was primitive at best. The Portuguese lost dozens, then scores of soldiers, significant losses given their small numbers. Nzinga's forces lost more in absolute terms, but they could draw on a larger population base, could replace losses more easily. But ultimately, the Portuguese advance could not be stopped, only delayed. By late 1626, they had reached Cabaça itself and laid siege to the capital. Nzinga held out for some weeks, her warriors launching sorties against the besiegers, attempting to disrupt the siege lines, to capture supplies, to create opportunities for a breakout. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The Portuguese cannon fired day after day, breaching the palisade walls, destroying buildings, making defense increasingly difficult. Supplies within the capital dwindled. Water became scarce. the pressure became unbearable. And so, one night, Nzinga led her remaining forces out of Cabasa through a gap in the Portuguese lines. They moved quickly through the darkness, taking paths through the forest that the Portuguese could not follow in the dark with their cumbersome equipment. By dawn, they had put significant distance between themselves and the besiegers. When the Portuguese finally entered Cabasa the next day, they found it largely abandoned. The houses were empty. The royal compound had been stripped of anything valuable. The population had fled with Nzinga or had scattered into the countryside. The Portuguese claimed victory. They had captured the capital of Ndongo. But it was an empty victory. They held buildings and land. But Nzinga remained free, her army remained intact, and the population remained hostile. The Portuguese could control the places where their soldiers stood, but the moment those soldiers moved on, royal authority reasserted itself. What followed was the phase of the war that would define Nzinga's military reputation, a campaign of mobility, guerrilla tactics, strategic retreats, and sudden strikes. This was warfare adapted to African conditions, to the realities of limited resources and Portuguese technological superiority. Nzinga's forces broke into smaller units that could move quickly through the forests and hills. They avoided open battle where Portuguese firearms and discipline would give them an insurmountable advantage. Instead, they attacked supply lines, ambushed isolated Portuguese detachments, raided the territories of Portuguese allied chiefs, and generally made the Portuguese occupation as costly and difficult as possible. Imagine, if you will, a Portuguese supply column making its way along a forest path. The soldiers are nervous, watching the trees on either side, knowing that attack could come at any moment, but not knowing from where. The forest is dense, the visibility limited to a few dozen paces. Every shadow might conceal an enemy warrior. Then suddenly, arrows begin to fall from the trees. Warriors emerge from concealment, throwing spears, rushing forward with war axes. The Portuguese formation breaks. Soldiers scramble for their muskets, but the weapons are slow to load, difficult to aim in the chaos. Some of the African auxiliaries flee, their loyalty to the Portuguese shallow and conditional. Within minutes, the ambush is over. Supplies are captured or destroyed, casualties are inflicted, and Nzinga's warriors vanish back into the forest before Portuguese reinforcements can arrive. This pattern repeated itself dozens, then hundreds of times over the following months and years. The Portuguese could win any battle where they could bring their full force to bear, but they could not be everywhere at once. They could not control the vast territories of the interior with their limited numbers. They could not protect every supply line, every allied village, every isolated garrison. As the war dragged on, Nzinga made a decision that would prove both strategically crucial and deeply controversial. She allied herself with the Imbangala, a group of warriors who lived outside the normal structures of Central African society. The Imbangala were feared throughout the region. They were military brotherhoods, composed primarily of young men who had been displaced by warfare, who had lost their families and villages, who had essentially become professional warriors living off plunder and the chaos of constant conflict. They practiced initiation rituals that European observers found shocking, rituals designed to sever initiates' ties to their former lives and create absolute loyalty to the warband. The Imbangala were formidable fighters, mobile and ruthless, unencumbered by the need to protect territory or civilian populations. They had their own leaders, their own customs, their own way of making war. And they had been both enemies and occasional allies of various kingdoms in the region, selling their services to whoever could pay or offer opportunities for plunder. For Nzinga to ally with the Imbangala was to embrace a force that many in her own kingdom viewed with horror and disgust. It was to accept warriors whose methods included practices that violated traditional social norms. but it was also to gain military strength at a time when she desperately needed it, to add experienced fighters to her forces, to adopt some of their tactical innovations. Nzinga did more than simply ally with the Imbangala. She incorporated elements of their organization into her own forces, creating new military units modeled on their structure. She adopted some of their tactical approaches, their emphasis on mobility and shock tactics, and she herself underwent their initiation rituals, demonstrating her willingness to fully embrace this alliance. This transformation was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it strengthened her military capabilities. Symbolically, it marked her evolution from a conventional ruler trying to preserve traditional structures to a revolutionary leader willing to break with tradition in order to survive and resist. Despite her best efforts, despite the skill of her mobile campaign, despite the alliance with the Imbangala, Nzinga gradually lost control of the core territories of Ndongo. The Portuguese were relentless, and they had one crucial advantage that no amount of military skill could overcome. They could draw on reinforcements and supplies from across the Atlantic, from the vast resources of the Portuguese Empire. By 1629, the Portuguese had installed a puppet Angola, a member of the royal family willing to accept Portuguese authority in exchange for nominal power. This puppet ruler controlled very little in reality, but his existence gave the Portuguese a veneer of legitimacy for their occupation. They claimed to be supporting the rightful Ngola against a usurper, conveniently ignoring the fact that their rightful ruler was completely dependent on Portuguese military power. Nzinga was forced to retreat eastward, away from the territories she had grown up in, away from the lands her father and brother had ruled. She moved with thousands of followers, warriors and their families, nobles who remained loyal, commoners who preferred her rule to Portuguese domination or enslavement. This mass movement of people was a humanitarian crisis in its own right. Imagine the column of refugees stretching for miles along forest paths. Warriors marching with weapons and shields, women carrying children and bundles of possessions. Elderly people struggling to keep pace, everyone anxious, hungry, exhausted. They slept in temporary camps, sheltering under whatever cover they could find. Food was scarce. The refugees had to forage, hunt, and rely on the hospitality of villages they passed through, though that hospitality was often grudging given the burden of feeding thousands of unexpected guests. Disease spread through the camps, dysentery, malaria, respiratory infections taking their toll, especially on the very young and very old. People died along the way, some from disease, some from exhaustion, some simply giving up, unable to continue. Bodies were buried in shallow graves by the side of the path, marked with simple stones or branches, the survivors pressing on because stopping meant death for everyone. Nzinga's destination was the Kingdom of Matamba, located to the east of Ndongo. Matamba was a separate kingdom with its own ruler, but it was smaller and less powerful than Ndongo had been. It was also far enough from the Portuguese coastal bases to offer some measure of security. What happened next is recorded differently in different sources, but the outcome is clear. By 1631, Nzinga had become the ruler of Matamba. Whether she conquered it through military force, whether the existing ruler died and she filled the power vacuum, whether some form of negotiation occurred, the details are murky. But Nzinga now had a territorial base again, a kingdom from which to continue her resistance. Matamba became Nzinga's headquarters for the next 3 decades. She established her capital there, built up fortifications, organized the territory's resources for continued warfare. The kingdom was more remote, the terrain more difficult for Portuguese expeditions to penetrate. It offered strategic depth, places to retreat to when Portuguese offensives became too intense. But Matamba was also smaller and less wealthy than Ndongo had been. Its agricultural base was more limited, its population was smaller. Nzinga had to work constantly to build up its strength, to integrate the refugees from Ndongo with the existing Matamba population, to create a unified kingdom from these disparate elements. She proved remarkably successful at this. She implemented administrative reforms, creating a centralized government structure. She organized the military along the lines she had developed during the mobile campaign, combining traditional forces with Imbangala-style units. She promoted capable people regardless of their origins, creating a meritocracy unusual for the time and place. And she continued to make war on the Portuguese, launching raids out of Matamba, attacking their allies, disrupting their attempts to consolidate control over the interior. The war had moved into a new phase, no longer a desperate defense of a shrinking kingdom, but rather a sustained resistance from a secure base, a long attritional struggle that the Portuguese could not win militarily, but which Nzinga could not afford to lose. Let us consider Nzinga's leadership during this period, the ways she maintained authority and inspired loyalty despite constant warfare and deprivation. She led from the front. This was not a queen who remained safe in the rear while others fought. She participated in military campaigns, shared the hardships of her warriors, demonstrated personal courage in combat. Portuguese accounts, hostile as they often are, repeatedly acknowledge her military prowess, describing her as a fierce warrior despite her age. She was now in her 50s. She maintained the ceremonial aspects of royalty even in difficult circumstances. When she held court, even in makeshift settings, the full regalia and rituals were observed. Drummers announced her presence. Attendants performed the prescribed ceremonies. This maintained continuity with the past, demonstrated that legitimate royal authority persisted despite the loss of traditional territories. She was also, by all accounts, charismatic and persuasive. She had the ability to inspire people to keep fighting despite overwhelming odds, to maintain hope when hope seemed irrational, to believe that resistance was possible and meaningful even when victory in any conventional sense seemed impossible. But her leadership was not just about inspiration. It was also about ruthlessness when necessary. She dealt harshly with disloyalty or cowardice. Those who defected to the Portuguese, or who even contemplated defection, faced severe punishment. She could not afford dissent or divided loyalties when the stakes were so high. She also understood the importance of propaganda and narrative. She cultivated a reputation for having special powers, for being blessed by the ancestors, for possessing what Europeans called magic, but which in her cultural context was a claim to spiritual authority. Whether she believed in these powers herself or simply used them as tools of statecraft, they enhanced her authority and made her seem more than merely human. The constant warfare took an enormous toll on everyone involved. For the Portuguese, it meant a grinding, frustrating campaign against an enemy who would not stand and fight, who melted away when confronted with superior force, only to reappear elsewhere. Soldiers died from disease and ambush far more than from pitched battles. Officers grew weary of pursuing an enemy who seemed impossible to definitively defeat. The costs mounted while the benefits, control over territory that produced little revenue beyond slaves, remained elusive. For Nzinga's people, the toll was even heavier. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war. Children were born in refugee camps or in Matamba during times of crisis. Young men were constantly at war, away from their families, fighting and dying in conflicts that seemed to have no end. Agricultural production was disrupted, leading to periodic food shortages. The social fabric was torn by the constant violence and displacement. And always, in the background, the slave trade continued. The Portuguese may not have been able to fully conquer the interior, but they could and did raid for captives. Every Portuguese military expedition captured people who were then sold into slavery. The wars themselves produced prisoners who ended up in the barracoons of Luanda. The constant conflict created refugees and displaced people who were vulnerable to kidnapping and enslavement. The population of the region declined during these decades. People died in warfare, from disease, from famine. They were carried away as slaves. They fled to more remote regions to escape the violence. The landscape became depopulated, with abandoned villages slowly being reclaimed by forest, fields returning to wilderness, the signs of human habitation fading. Imagine a village that had existed for generations, where families had lived and died, where children had played and crops had been harvested, where the ancestors had been honored and life had followed its ancient rhythms. Now it stands empty, the houses falling into decay, the paths overgrown with vegetation, the only sounds the wind through the thatch and the calls of birds. This scene repeated itself across the region hundreds, thousands of times as the long war ground on. But amid all the destruction and suffering, there was also adaptation and survival. People learned to live with the constant threat of violence, to flee when necessary, to rebuild when possible. Communities became more mobile, less attached to specific places, ready to move at short notice. Trade networks shifted, finding routes that avoided Portuguese-controlled areas. Cultural practices evolved to incorporate the new realities. Nzinga's kingdom in Matamba became a refuge for those fleeing Portuguese control. Escaped slaves made their way there, knowing they would find protection. Refugees from conquered territories sought shelter. Warriors who refused to accept Portuguese rule joined her forces. Matamba became not just Nzinga's kingdom, but a symbol of resistance, a place where African independence persisted against all odds. The kingdom developed a hybrid culture, blending elements from Ndongo and Matamba, incorporating influences from the Imbangala, adapting to the demands of constant warfare. New rituals emerged, new forms of social organization, new ways of thinking about identity and belonging that reflected the chaotic circumstances. Nzinga herself embodied this hybridity. She was Christian and traditional, diplomat and warrior, queen and general. She wore European clothing at times and traditional garments at others. She negotiated with Portuguese governors while simultaneously ordering raids on their settlements. She was, in a sense, creating a new kind of African leadership adapted to the age of European colonialism, flexible, pragmatic, resilient. Even as the military struggle continued, Nzinga never abandoned diplomacy. She sent embassies to the Portuguese, sometimes proposing peace, sometimes simply buying time, always probing for weaknesses or divisions she could exploit. She sent missions to the Dutch when they briefly captured Luanda in the 1640s, seeking an alliance against their mutual Portuguese enemy. She maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring African kingdoms, building networks of resistance. These diplomatic efforts were often frustrating. The Portuguese negotiated in bad faith, making promises they had no intention of keeping, using diplomacy to gather intelligence about Nzinga's strengths and vulnerabilities. Other African kingdoms were often more interested in their own survival than in united resistance. The Dutch proved unreliable allies, ultimately abandoning their foothold in Angola and leaving Nzinga to face the returning Portuguese alone. But Nzinga persisted, understanding that diplomacy was another weapon in her arsenal, another way to complicate Portuguese plans, another means of survival. She demonstrated a remarkable ability to shift strategies, to move between war and negotiation, to be flexible without ever losing sight of her core objective, maintaining independence and preventing the complete Portuguese conquest of her people. The war continued through the 1630s and into the 1640s, a rhythm of raids and counter-raids, advances and retreats, negotiations and betrayals. Nzinga aged, entering her 60s, then approaching 70, but showed no signs of stepping back from leadership. She remained actively involved in military campaigns, in diplomatic negotiations, in the day-to-day administration of her kingdom. The Portuguese governors changed. Fernando de Souza was replaced by others, each bringing their own strategies and priorities, but all ultimately pursuing the same goal of colonial expansion. Some were more aggressive, launching major offensives into the interior. Others were more cautious, focusing on consolidating coastal holdings. But the fundamental conflict persisted, regardless of individual personalities. The landscape of the conflict shifted, but the essentials remained the same. The Portuguese controlled the coast and some interior areas, but could not break Nzinga's resistance. Nzinga maintained independence in Matamba, but could not drive the Portuguese out of the region entirely. It was a stalemate of sorts, though one characterized by ongoing violence rather than stable peace. And always in the background, the slave ships continued to depart from Luanda, their holds packed with human cargo. The Atlantic slave trade entered its most intense phase during these decades. Hundreds of thousands, then millions of Africans would be transported across the ocean over the following century. The wars in Angola, Nzinga's wars, fed this trade, providing captives even as they also represented resistance to it. The night has grown late, and the fire in Nzinga's compound in Matamba burns low. Warriors sleep around it, exhausted from the day's march or training. Sentries patrol the perimeter, watching for any signs of Portuguese attack, though none is expected tonight. Nzinga herself sits in her house, the light of oil lamps casting flickering shadows on the walls. She is planning, always planning. Tomorrow's march, next week's raid, next month's diplomatic mission. She has been planning for decades now, and the planning will continue until either victory or death releases her from this burden. But victory, she knows, is not the complete defeat of the Portuguese. That is impossible with the resources available to her. Victory is survival, independence, the maintenance of a free African kingdom in defiance of colonial conquest. Victory is every day that her people remain free, every slave trader thwarted, every Portuguese plan disrupted. And so she continues year after year, sustained by will and determination, and the knowledge that there is no alternative. To surrender is to accept enslavement. To give up is to betray all those who have died resisting. To stop fighting is to make their sacrifices meaningless. The lamp flame gutters and steadies. Outside, an owl calls in the darkness. And Nzinga returns to her planning, preparing for another day, another battle, another year in the long struggle for survival. Imagine yourself awakening in the lower hive levels of a forgotten imperial world, one that has slowly, almost imperceptibly, fallen under the influence of the Dark Prince. The transition was gradual, so gradual that most inhabitants never noticed the change. The alarm chimes that once marked the beginning of labor shifts now sound different. The tones are no longer harsh and utilitarian, but strangely melodious, almost hypnotic. You lie on your sleeping pallet and you notice that even this simple surface has changed. Where once there was only rough fabric, now there are textures, smooth patches alongside rough, creating sensations that your mind finds difficult to ignore. The air itself has transformed. The perpetual chemical tang of the manufactorum has been joined by other scents, incense perhaps, or perfumes, though their origin remains unclear. These aromas drift through the ventilation systems, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. Some workers have begun to report strange dreams, visions of colors that don't exist in the normal spectrum, sensations that linger long after waking. As you rise and prepare for the day, you notice the clothing distributed by the overseers has changed. The standard grey coveralls now feature small embellishments, a patch of violet fabric here, a golden thread there. These additions serve no practical purpose, yet they persist. Some workers have begun to add their own modifications, driven by urges they cannot fully explain. The walk to the assembly line takes you through corridors that were once purely functional. Now, someone has painted murals on the walls. The imagery is abstract at first glance, swirls of color, geometric patterns that seem to shift when viewed from different angles. But if you look too long, you might perceive faces within the patterns or symbols that tug at something deep in your subconscious. The work itself has not changed in its fundamental nature. The assembly line still demands your attention. Your hands still perform the same repetitive motions, attaching components to half-finished products that will be shipped off-world. But the rhythm has altered. Where once the machinery operated at a steady, grinding pace, now it seems almost syncopated, creating patterns of sound that are strangely pleasant. Your fellow workers have changed as well. Conversations that once focused solely on productivity quotas and ration distributions now include other topics. Someone mentions a gathering in the underhive, a place where the lights are dim and the music flows like water. Another worker displays a small tattoo just visible beneath their sleeve, an abstract design that seems to writhe in the flickering light. The overseer walks past, and you notice they no longer carry a shock stick. Instead, they whisper suggestions, offer encouragements that are almost seductive in their gentleness. Production has actually increased, though the reason remains unclear. Perhaps workers are more motivated, or perhaps they have simply lost track of time, forgetting to take breaks, forgetting to rest. The meal period arrives, and the nutrition paste dispensed by the servitors has acquired flavor. It should be impossible. The paste is manufactured to exact specifications, designed for efficiency rather than taste. Yet somehow, it now possesses subtle notes of sweetness, hints of spices that shouldn't exist in its chemical composition. Some workers consume their portions slowly, savoring each mouthful, while others request additional servings, driven by hungers that mere nutrition cannot satisfy. In the communal rest area, you observe the gradual transformation of social dynamics. Groups form around those with natural charisma, individuals who seem to radiate an almost magnetic presence. They speak of liberation from the drudgery of existence, of experiences that transcend the mundane grind of hive life. Their words are persuasive, their promises alluring. One such individual, a woman who works in the sorting section, has begun to attract particular attention. She speaks of visions granted in dreams, of a presence that offers unlimited potential for sensation and experience. Her eyes gleam with an intensity that should be alarming, yet somehow draws others closer. She describes a patron, a dark benefactor who asks only that its followers pursue their deepest desires without restraint. As evening approaches, the shift should end, but many workers linger. The boundary between work time and personal time has begun to blur. Some continue their tasks, driven by a perfectionism that verges on obsession. They file components until the edges are impossibly smooth, polish surfaces until they gleam like mirrors, pursuing a standard of excellence that exceeds any practical requirement. Others gather in small groups, engaged in activities that would have once been unthinkable. They share stories, not of the emperor's glory or the imperium's might, but of personal experiences, moments of pleasure, instances of beauty, memories of sensations that linger. The conversations grow increasingly intimate, barriers of propriety slowly dissolving. In the sleeping quarters, the transformation becomes even more apparent. Personal spaces that were once strictly utilitarian now feature decorations. Workers have fashioned ornaments from discarded materials, sculptures of wire and scrap metal, hangings of colored fabric, arrangements of found objects that create unexpected visual harmonies. Some quarters feature mirrors, surfaces polished to reflectivity, allowing occupants to study their own appearances with increasing fascination. Sleep itself has become strange. Dreams are vivid, almost overwhelming in their intensity. You dream of palaces built from impossible geometries, of gardens where every plant blooms in colors that hurt to perceive. You dream of music that can be tasted, of textures that produce sound, of sensory experiences that transcend normal categorization. In these dreams you sometimes glimpse a figure, beautiful and terrible, alluring and horrific. It speaks without words, promising fulfillment of every desire, satisfaction of every craving. The figure's presence fills you with sensations that are simultaneously pleasurable and disturbing, creating a cognitive dissonance that your waking mind struggles to process. The cycle repeats day after day. The changes accelerate. Workers begin to display physical alterations. Nothing dramatic at first, just subtle shifts. Someone's eyes seem to reflect light differently. Another person's movements become fluid, almost serpentine in their grace. A third individual develops a voice that carries unusual resonance, making even mundane statements sound compelling. The foreman, once a stern enforcer of imperial efficiency, has embraced the transformation most completely. They now dress in robes of purple and gold, their face painted with intricate designs. They speak of the facility achieving its true purpose, transcending mere manufacture to become a temple of creation, where every product is a work of art, every action an expression of divine inspiration. Religious services, previously conducted by rote recitation of imperial creeds, have acquired new elements. The words remain largely the same, but the delivery has changed. Prayers are chanted in harmonies that create unusual resonances. Litanies are accompanied by rhythmic movements, almost dance-like in their coordination. The emperor is still invoked, but the interpretations have shifted, emphasizing aspects of perfection, beauty, and transcendence over duty and sacrifice. Some workers have begun to disappear, vanishing during off-shifts. Rumors circulate about deeper levels, secret chambers where the true faithful gather. Those who return from these expeditions seem changed, their eyes distant, their movements languid. They speak in vague terms of revelations, of experiences beyond description, of pleasures that redefine the very concept of sensation. The manufacturum's output has shifted as well. Products still emerge from the assembly lines, but their nature has evolved. What were once simple tools and components now feature unnecessary embellishments, decorative elements, aesthetic flourishes, design choices that serve no functional purpose. Quality control inspectors approve these modifications. Some even encourage them, praising the artistic vision of the workers. As weeks turn to months, the facility becomes increasingly isolated. Communications with higher imperial authorities grow sporadic. Supply shipments arrive less frequently, but no one seems particularly concerned. The workers have learned to improvise, to create what they need from available materials, to sustain themselves through their own ingenuity and the strange abundance that seems to flow from their devotion. You find yourself standing before a mirror, studying your own reflection. When did your features become so refined, so perfectly symmetrical? When did your eyes acquire that peculiar gleam? You cannot remember, but the reflection pleases you. You spend long minutes admiring the curve of your cheekbone, the arch of your eyebrow, the perfect proportion of your features. A voice whispers in your mind, or perhaps it comes from just behind you. It speaks of greater transformations to come, of possibilities that exceed your current imagination. It promises ascension, transcendence, an existence defined entirely by the pursuit of perfection in all its forms. The final barrier falls on a night when the entire facility gathers in the main assembly hall. The foreman stands before the assembled workers, flanked by those who have journeyed deepest into the hidden levels. They speak of a revelation, a moment of collective awakening. The walls themselves seem to pulse with anticipation, reality growing thin, the barrier between the material universe and something else wearing increasingly transparent. And then, for just a moment, that barrier tears completely. You glimpse what lies beyond, a realm of impossible beauty and terrible horror, where every sensation exists in its most extreme form, where pleasure and pain merge into a single overwhelming experience. The vision sears itself into your consciousness, and you understand, truly understand, what has been happening. This is the daily existence of those who fall under Slaanesh's influence, not a sudden corruption, but a gradual seduction, not dramatic transformation, but incremental change. The Dark Prince does not demand submission through fear, but offers temptation through promise. And in the grinding desperation of imperial life, in the endless drudgery of mere survival, those promises can seem almost reasonable. The workers continue their lives, but they are no longer truly servants of the emperor. They have become something else, devotees of a power that feeds on their experiences, their sensations, their endless pursuit of ever greater intensities. They do not recognize themselves as corrupted, for their descent has been too gradual, too seductive, too perfectly tailored to their individual weaknesses. This is how Slaanesh claims souls, not through force, but through persuasion, not through terror, but through temptation. And in a galaxy where life is suffering and death is commonplace, the promise of pleasure, however corrupted, can seem like salvation itself. Let us drift back now, far back through the millennia, to understand the origin of the Dark Prince itself. This is not the biography of a mortal being, but the chronicle of a god's catastrophic birth, an event that shattered a galaxy and echoed through the immaterium for all eternity. The story begins not with Slaanesh, but with the Eldar, an ancient race of immense psychic power and technological sophistication. Imagine an empire that spanned the stars, a civilization so advanced that it had conquered nearly every material challenge. The Eldar had defeated death itself through the use of spirit stones and the infinity circuit. They had mastered technology that made the constructs of humanity seem primitive by comparison. They had achieved, by all measurable standards, perfection. But perfection, once achieved, creates a peculiar problem. What does a civilization do when it has conquered every external challenge? What occupies minds that need not concern themselves with survival, with conflict, with struggle? The Eldar turned inward, seeking challenges and experiences within themselves rather than in the material universe. This introspection began innocently enough. The Eldar had always been a people of refined sensibilities, appreciating art, music, and beauty in all its forms. Their cities were works of aesthetic perfection. Their culture celebrated creativity and expression. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, appreciation became obsession. The transition occurred over thousands of years, so gradual that no single generation recognized the change. Each generation pushed boundaries slightly further than the last, seeking experiences that were slightly more intense, pleasures that were slightly more refined. What began as artistic exploration evolved into hedonistic excess. The Eldar crafted pleasure cults, organizations dedicated to the pursuit of ever more extreme sensations. Some sought perfection through physical experience, developing techniques of sensation that pushed biological limits. Others pursued intellectual and emotional extremes, creating art so beautiful it drove viewers to madness, composing music that could kill with its perfection, writing poetry that rewrote the neural pathways of those who read it. Still others delved into darker pursuits. Pain became just another sensation to be explored, catalogued, perfected. Violence transformed from necessity to art form. The distinction between pleasure and suffering blurred, then dissolved entirely. The Eldar pursued experience for its own sake, regardless of consequence, regardless of morality, regardless of the damage inflicted on themselves or others. This behavior had consequences beyond the physical realm. The Eldar are psychic beings, their thoughts and emotions rippling through the warp with unusual intensity. Each act of excess, each moment of extreme sensation created echoes in the immaterium. These echoes accumulated over millennia, coalescing, gathering mass and consciousness. Something was forming in the warp, gestating in the collective psychic emanations of an entire civilization. It fed on their excess, grew stronger with each passing generation, developed awareness and hunger in equal measure. The Eldar seers began to perceive its presence, a great darkness growing in the immaterium, a predator forming from their own spiritual waste. Some among the Eldar recognized the danger. Seers and farseers warned of catastrophe, prophesied doom, urged their people to turn back from the precipice. But their warnings went unheeded. The pleasure cults had become too powerful, the addiction to excess too deeply embedded in Eldar culture. Those who spoke of restraint were dismissed as primitives, as beings unable to appreciate the heights of experience that others had achieved. The craft world Eldar represent those who listened to the warnings. They built vast spacecraft, entire cities capable of traveling through the void, and fled their homeworlds. They imposed strict discipline on themselves, created the path system to channel their emotions safely, developed technologies to shield their souls from the growing darkness. They abandoned their civilization to save their species. The Exodites took a different approach, fleeing to primitive worlds where they could live simple lives, deliberately reducing their psychic presence, becoming closer to nature and further from the excess that threatened to consume their kind. They traded technological sophistication for spiritual survival, but most Eldar remained, unable or unwilling to abandon the lives they had built, the pleasures they had cultivated, the experiences they had come to require. They continued their descent into excess, even as the darkness in the warp grew ever larger, ever hungrier, ever closer to birth. The moment of birth, when it finally came, was cataclysmic beyond mortal comprehension. In a single psychic scream that echoed across the galaxy, Slaanesh tore itself free from the warp, achieving full consciousness and godhood in an instant of terrible transcendence. The event is known as the Fall, and it marked the end of the Eldar civilization. The psychic shockwave obliterated trillions of Eldar instantly. Their souls, unprepared and unprotected, were torn from their bodies and drawn directly into the newly born god. Slaanesh consumed them, devouring their essence, experiencing every memory, every sensation, every emotion they had ever felt in the moment of consumption. It was the ultimate expression of the excess they had worshipped, total, absolute, eternal consumption. The material universe suffered as well. The region of space that had been the heart of the Eldar Empire simply ceased to exist in normal terms. Reality tore open, creating a massive wound in space-time that would later be called the Eye of Terror. Within this region, the laws of physics became suggestions rather than rules. Time flowed in multiple directions simultaneously. Space folded in on itself. The boundary between the warp and reality dissolved almost completely. Slaanesh's birth also had an unexpected consequence. It created a corridor of relative calm in the warp storms that had isolated Terra from the rest of the galaxy for thousands of years. This calm allowed the Emperor of Mankind to launch his great crusade, reuniting humanity's scattered colonies. The irony is profound. The birth of a chaos god enabled humanity's expansion, even as it doomed countless billions to eventual corruption. But what of Slaanesh itself? What manner of being emerged from this catastrophic genesis? The Dark Prince, as its followers call it, is perhaps the youngest of the chaos gods, but no less terrible for its relative youth. Where Khorne embodies rage and bloodshed, where Nurgle represents decay and endurance, where Tzeentch manifests change and ambition, Slaanesh personifies excess in all its forms. The god's nature is contradictory, reflecting the contradictions inherent in its birth. Slaanesh is both beautiful and hideous, alluring and repulsive, seductive and terrifying. It promises fulfillment while delivering only emptiness. It offers perfection while creating only corruption. It whispers of pleasure while inflicting exquisite torment. Slaanesh's consciousness, if it can be called that, operates on principles alien to mortal understanding. It experiences every sensation felt by every being in the universe simultaneously, yet hungers constantly for more. It possesses infinite patience and absolute impatience. It values beauty above all things, yet corrupts everything it touches. These contradictions do not trouble it. They are fundamental to its nature. The god's realm within the warp reflects these contradictions. The Palace of Pleasure exists simultaneously as the most beautiful and most horrifying place in existence. Its architecture defies geometry, creating spaces that are both vast and intimate, public and private, welcoming and threatening. Gardens bloom with flowers that sing and stones that weep. Rivers flow with liquids that might be wine or blood or something that is somehow both. Within this palace, Slaanesh holds court among its demonic servants and mortal supplicants. Time has no meaning here. An instant can last centuries. Millennia can pass in heartbeats. Visitors might arrive seeking pleasure and find torment, or seek torment and discover pleasure, or find that the distinction between the two has ceased to exist entirely. One such fragment, referenced in an inquisitorial report, but never directly quoted, apparently suggested that Slaanesh's birth was not inevitable, that the forming god was influenced and shaped by those who sought to control it. If this is true, it raises disturbing questions about responsibility and agency. Did the Eldar accidentally create Slaanesh, or did they deliberately birth it while believing they could maintain control? The mystery deepens when we consider the relationship between Slaanesh and the Eldar gods. Before the fall, the Eldar pantheon included numerous deities, each embodying aspects of their civilization and nature. Cain, the god of war; Isha, the goddess of life and healing; Vol, the god of craftsmen; Segurak, the laughing god; Moriheg, the crone goddess of fate. When Slaanesh was born, it consumed most of these gods, devouring their essence as it devoured the Eldar themselves. Only fragments remain. Cain was shattered into pieces, the avatar that each craft world maintains representing just a shard of his former power. Isha was captured by Nurgle, imprisoned in his garden, forced to test his diseases for all eternity. Segurak escaped into the webway, laughing as he fled, somehow eluding the newborn god's grasp. The fate of the other gods remains unclear. Were they completely consumed, their essence absorbed into Slaanesh? Do fragments of them survive somewhere in the warp, too diminished to manifest? Or do they exist in some altered state, merged with the god that devoured them, influencing it from within? Some Eldar mystics believe that Slaanesh contains within itself the echoes of everything it has consumed. Not just the gods, but every Eldar soul, every memory, every experience from before the fall. If this is true, then Slaanesh is not just the destroyer of Eldar civilization, but also its preserver, maintaining in corrupted form everything that was lost. This possibility is simultaneously comforting and horrifying, suggesting that nothing is truly gone, but also that nothing can be recovered without embracing damnation. The question of why the fall occurred when it did, rather than earlier or later, has occupied Eldar philosophers for millennia. Evidence suggests the pleasure cults had existed for thousands of years before the final catastrophe. What tipped the balance? What transformed gradual corruption into sudden apocalypse? Some theories suggest a threshold effect, that Slaanesh required a certain critical mass of psychic energy to achieve consciousness, and the Eldar civilization reached this threshold at a specific moment. Others propose that external events triggered the birth, perhaps conflicts in the warp between other entities, perhaps actions taken by other species that destabilized the immaterium at a crucial time. A darker theory, supported by fragments of pre-fall prophecy, suggests that the Eldar themselves triggered the birth deliberately. Not through ignorance or accident, but through conscious choice made by those who believed they understood what they were creating. If true, this transforms the fall from tragedy into something more complex, a catastrophic failure of judgment by those who thought themselves wise enough to birth and control a god. The cultural legacy of the fall permeates every aspect of modern Eldar society. The path system that governs Craftworld Eldar exists specifically to prevent a recurrence, channeling emotions and abilities into strictly controlled forms. An Eldar walks the path of the warrior, dedicating themselves entirely to martial pursuits while suppressing all other aspects of their nature. Then they might transition to the path of the artisan, abandoning warfare to focus on creative expression. Each path is walked completely with total dedication before transitioning to another. This system ensures that no Eldar ever pursues perfection in all things simultaneously, never allows expertise in one area to bleed into obsession that encompasses their entire being. It is a cultural technology designed to prevent the excess that doomed their ancestors, a permanent reminder written into the structure of daily life. The spirit stones that every Craftworld Eldar wears represent another cultural adaptation. These psychic matrices capture an Eldar's soul upon death, preserving it within the Craftworld's infinity circuit. Death without a spirit stone means immediate consumption by Slaanesh, an eternity of torment in the god's realm. This knowledge shapes Eldar behavior profoundly. They are cautious in ways other species are not, reluctant to risk their lives unnecessarily, aware that death means worse than oblivion. Yet this caution creates its own problems. Craftworld Eldar live in the shadow of extinction, their population slowly declining despite their greatly extended lifespans. They cannot afford to reproduce quickly, as each new soul represents a potential offering to the god that hunts them. They cannot expand aggressively, as conquest requires risk that they cannot justify. They are trapped in a defensive posture, preserving what remains rather than building anything new. The mysteries surrounding Slaanesh and the Fall continue to multiply rather than resolve. Each discovery raises new questions. Each answer reveals deeper layers of uncertainty. Archaeologists uncover ruins that contradict established histories. Farseers receive visions that suggest alternative interpretations. Scholars in Komorrah release carefully edited information that reshapes understanding while concealing deeper truths. And through it all, the Dark Prince watches and waits. Slaanesh itself is the ultimate archaeological site, containing within its essence everything that the Eldar were and everything they feared to become. Every consumed soul, every destroyed god, every fragment of the civilization that birthed it, all preserved in the god's terrible consciousness, twisted beyond recognition, yet somehow still present. The fall, then, is not truly past. It continues in every moment, every Eldar soul that dies and is consumed, every Craftworld Eldar who strays too far from the path, every Dark Eldar who feeds just a bit too much on the suffering of others. The catastrophe that destroyed the Eldar Empire was not a single event, but the beginning of an eternal present, a wound that will never heal, a mistake that can never be corrected. This is the mystery at the heart of Slaanesh, not a puzzle to be solved, but a tragedy to be endured. The Eldar cannot defeat the god they created, cannot reclaim what was lost, cannot undo what was done. They can only survive, preserving fragments of glory, walking carefully controlled paths, hoping that somewhere in the infinite futures that might unfold, a solution exists that they have not yet imagined. Now we descend into the final layer of our exploration, examining the terrible hierarchy of demons that serve the Dark Prince. These are not metaphorical entities, but actual beings, manifestations of Slaanesh's will given form in the material universe. From the lowest demonettes to the mightiest keepers of secrets, each represents an aspect of the god's nature, each serves a purpose in the eternal pursuit of excess. Let us begin with the demonettes, the most common servants of Slaanesh. These entities embody the god's fundamental nature, beauty twisted into horror, seduction merged with threat, pleasure inseparable from pain. A demonette appears simultaneously attractive and repulsive. their form shifting based on the observer's perceptions and desires. Imagine encountering such a being. At first glance, you perceive beauty, features that conform to your culture's standards of attractiveness, proportions that please your eye, movements that suggest grace and fluidity. But as you continue to observe, the horror emerges. The features are too perfect, the proportions slightly wrong in ways that trigger instinctive revulsion. The grace becomes predatory. The fluidity suggests something boneless and wrong. When daemonettes speak, their voices carry multiple tones simultaneously, honeyed promises layered over mocking laughter, seductive whispers hiding cruel threats. They speak of pleasures beyond mortal comprehension, of sensations that transcend normal experience, of perfection that can be achieved through surrender. Their words are carefully chosen to exploit the listener's desires and fears, customized to the individual in ways that suggest intimate knowledge of the victim's psyche. In combat, daemonettes move with unnatural speed and precision. They wield weapons called piercing claws, blades designed not just to kill, but to create maximum suffering. Each strike targets nerve clusters, severing connections in ways that maximize pain while prolonging life. They do not fight to win quickly, but to extend the experience, to savor each moment of their victim's anguish. Yet the demonettes are merely the foundation of Slaanesh's hierarchy. Above them stand the fiends of Slaanesh, bizarre entities that combine multiple species into single horrifying forms. A fiend possesses the body of some great predatory cat, the tail of a scorpion, and a head that defies easy description, part serpent, part something else entirely, with features that shift and recombine as you observe them. Fiends serve as hunters and trackers in Slaanesh's service. They pursue prey across vast distances, driven by supernatural senses that detect not physical presence, but psychic emanations. They can smell desire, taste fear, hear the whispered prayers of those who seek forbidden pleasures. Once a fiend marks a target, escape becomes nearly impossible. They will pursue across worlds, through the warp itself if necessary, patient in their hunt because time has no meaning to them. The fiend's most terrible weapon is its musk, a psychic toxin that induces overwhelming sensations in those who breathe it. Victims report experiencing every sensation they have ever felt simultaneously, every pleasure and every pain, every moment of joy and every instant of suffering, all compressed into a single eternal now. The experience shatters minds, reducing even hardened warriors to catatonic shells, lost in the infinite maze of their own memories. Seekers of Slaanesh represent the god's aspect as the eternal pursuer of sensation. These demons ride atop steeds of Slaanesh, demonic mounts that gallop across reality itself in search of new experiences. The Seekers serve as Slaanesh's eyes and ears in the mortal realm, observing, cataloguing, reporting back on potential sources of excess that might feed their god. A Seeker appears as a demonette mounted on a serpentine creature whose hide ripples with impossible colors. The steed moves faster than physics should allow, its hooves striking surfaces that should not bear weight. Running across water, galloping up vertical walls, racing through the air itself when necessary. Rider and mount share a symbiotic connection, thinking and acting as a single entity, pursuing their prey with single-minded determination. These entities often lead the vanguard when Slaanesh's forces enter the material universe. They race ahead of the main demon host, identifying targets, spreading terror, sowing confusion. Their speed makes them nearly impossible to defend against conventionally. By the time defenses are raised, the Seekers have already struck and withdrawn, leaving chaos in their wake. Rising higher in the hierarchy, we encounter the Heralds of Slaanesh, greater demons who serve as direct extensions of the god's will. These entities possess intelligence and autonomy that lesser demons lack. They can plan, strategize, and adapt in ways that simple demonettes cannot. Each herald commands legions of lesser servants, directing them in pursuit of Slaanesh's goals. Heralds take many forms, each reflecting a particular aspect of excess. Some embody physical perfection, their forms sculpted to impossible standards of beauty. Others represent artistic achievement, their very presence inspiring mortals to create works of terrible magnificence. Still others manifest as pure sensation made solid, beings whose touch induces experiences beyond mortal capacity to process. The herald's role extends beyond simple warfare. They serve as tempters and corrupters, appearing to mortals who stand at crossroads, who face choices that will determine their fate. A herald might appear to an artist struggling with their work, offering inspiration and technique in exchange for small compromises, to a warrior seeking victory, promising strength and skill for minor sacrifices, to a leader facing impossible decisions, suggesting solutions that require only slight moral flexibility. These corruptions unfold over years or decades, the herald patient in its work. It does not demand immediate surrender, but guides its target gradually, celebrating each small step into damnation, offering rewards for each boundary crossed. By the time the victim realizes the depth of their corruption, escape has become impossible. They have become too dependent on the power the herald provides, too committed to the path they have walked, too deeply enmeshed in the web of compromises they have made. Above the heralds stand the Keeper of Secrets, the greatest of Slaanesh's demonic servants. These entities are the Dark Prince's most trusted agents, dispatched only when matters of great importance require attention. To encounter a Keeper of Secrets is to face an aspect of Slaanesh itself, a fragment of the god's consciousness given independent form. A Keeper of Secrets towers over mortals, standing 3 or 4 times the height of a human. Its form combines elements that should not coexist. Masculine and feminine features merged into singular androgyny, strength and delicacy united in impossible harmony, beauty and horror so intertwined they become indistinguishable. 4 arms extend from its torso, each terminating in claws capable of tearing through ceramite armor. Wings of impossible delicacy sprout from its back, membranes so thin they appear translucent yet strong enough to bear the demon's weight in flight. But the Keeper's true weapon is not physical. These entities possess knowledge, terrible, forbidden knowledge, accumulated across millennia of existence. They know the secret names of things, the true nature of reality, the hidden connections that bind the universe together. This knowledge gives them power over mortals, allowing them to manipulate, coerce, and dominate in ways that transcend physical force. When a Keeper of Secrets speaks, reality itself seems to pause to listen. Its voice carries harmonics that resonate with the listener's deepest nature, speaking directly to the subconscious, bypassing rational thought to trigger primal responses. It does not merely communicate information, but reshapes the listener's understanding of reality itself. Those who hear a Keeper speak often find their memories altered, their perceptions shifted, their very identity subtly transformed. The Keeper's knowledge extends to individual mortals as well. These demons can perceive a person's entire history, every choice made, every desire suppressed, every fear hidden. They use this knowledge with surgical precision, identifying vulnerabilities, exploiting weaknesses, offering exactly what the victim most desires in exchange for what they value least, making damnation seem like salvation. In combat, a Keeper of Secrets is devastatingly effective. It moves with impossible grace, each gesture perfectly economical, each strike positioned with mathematical precision. It wields weapons that exist on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, blades that cut flesh and spirit together, severing the connection between body and soul. Victims do not simply die, they are unmade, their essence scattered across dimensions, their existence retroactively corrupted, so that even their memories become sources of anguish for those who knew them. Yet the Keeper's greatest strength lies in its ability to avoid combat entirely. These demons prefer to achieve their goals through manipulation and seduction rather than force. They establish cults among mortal populations, corrupting entire societies from within. They infiltrate institutions, subvert hierarchies, turn the structures of civilization into mechanisms of damnation. They are patient beyond mortal comprehension, willing to work across generations if necessary, planting seeds of corruption that will not bear fruit for centuries. The relationship between these various demonic servants creates a hierarchy that mirrors and inverts mortal social structures. Demonettes serve heralds, who serve keepers of secrets, who serve Slaanesh itself. But this hierarchy is fluid rather than rigid, based on capability and achievement rather than static position. A demonette who successfully corrupts a particularly valuable soul might be elevated, granted greater power and autonomy. A herald who fails might be demoted, reduced back to lesser form as punishment. This competitive structure ensures that Slaanesh's servants constantly strive to outdo each other, each seeking to claim the most souls, to corrupt the most thoroughly, to achieve the greatest excess. They compete not from fear of punishment, but from desire for reward, from hunger for the sensation of success, from addiction to the pleasure of their god's approval. The demons also display distinct behavioral patterns based on the aspect of Slaanesh they embody. Some focus on physical sensation, seeking victims who crave tactile experiences. Others pursue intellectual or emotional excess, targeting scholars who hunger for forbidden knowledge, or artists who seek inspiration regardless of cost. Still others specialize in pride and perfectionism, corrupting those who cannot accept anything less than absolute flawlessness. These specializations create a terrible efficiency in Slaanesh's operations. No matter what form a mortal's weakness takes, a demon exists who specializes in exploiting exactly that vulnerability. The lonely find companionship, the ambitious receive power, the curious discover secrets, the artist achieves perfection. All are served, all are satisfied, and all are damned in precisely the ways most suited to their nature. The summoning of these demons represents one of the most dangerous acts a mortal can attempt. Even minor demons like demonettes require elaborate rituals, specific materials, and carefully constructed bindings to control. Greater entities demand proportionally greater effort and risk. A keeper of secrets might require sacrifices of hundreds or thousands, months of preparation, and psychic wards that drain the life from those who maintain them. Yet mortals continue to attempt such summonings, driven by desperation or ambition or simple curiosity. They believe they can control what they call forth, can bargain with entities whose nature they do not understand, can achieve their goals and escape consequences. The demons encourage these beliefs, appearing cooperative, offering fair terms, suggesting mutually beneficial arrangements. The truth reveals itself too late. The bindings always have flaws, the bargains always contain hidden costs, the demons always possess patience beyond mortal comprehension. They wait, sometimes for years or decades, for the moment when their summoner's guard drops. Then they strike, claiming not just the summoner, but often everyone connected to them. Entire communities corrupted or destroyed by a single act of forbidden ritual. The demons of Slaanesh also interact with other chaos forces in complex ways. They view Khorne's servants with contempt, considering them brutish and unsophisticated. Yet they sometimes cooperate with them, recognizing that bloodshed creates opportunities for excess. They maintain cautious relationships with Nurgle's plague-bearer, both groups appreciating physical sensation, though pursuing it through different means. They work most easily with Xianqi's horrors, both groups valuing subtlety and long-term planning. But these alliances remain temporary and unstable. The Chaos Gods compete as much as cooperate, and their servants reflect this rivalry. Demons of different gods might unite against a common enemy, but they remain fundamentally opposed in nature and purpose. A demonette and a bloodletter might fight side by side against imperial forces, but neither truly trusts the other, and both would gladly betray their temporary ally if opportunity arose. The question of whether these demons possess true consciousness remains debated among imperial scholars. Are they individuals with their own thoughts and desires, or merely extensions of Slaanesh's will, puppets dancing on strings of divine intention? The evidence suggests both possibilities might be simultaneously true, that the demons are aspects of Slaanesh, yet also possess a degree of autonomy, that they serve their god's will while also pursuing their own agendas. This paradox reflects the nature of chaos itself, where contradictions coexist without resolution, where beings can be simultaneously one and many, individual and collective, slave and master. The demons embody this contradiction, serving Slaanesh absolutely, while also maintaining identity separate from their god, thinking thoughts that are both their own and extensions of divine consciousness. The threat these entities pose extends beyond physical danger. A demon of Slaanesh corrupts not just bodies but souls, not just individuals but entire civilizations. They transform victims into accomplices, making them complicit in their own damnation. They subvert meaning itself, redefining concepts of beauty, pleasure and perfection until they serve only corruption. Yet despite their terrible power, these demons are not invincible. Faith can repel them, particularly faith backed by psychic might. The Emperor's light burns them, causing pain that penetrates their unnatural existence. Sanctified weapons can wound them permanently, destroying their manifestations and banishing them back to the warp. Rituals of exorcism can drive them from possessed hosts, severing their connection to the material universe. But victory against such entities comes at cost. Those who battle demons of Slaanesh must resist constant temptation, must guard against subtle corruption, must maintain absolute discipline in thought and deed. A moment's weakness, a single lapse in concentration, an instant of doubt or desire, any of these can provide an opening for demonic influence to take hold. The Inquisition maintains entire orders dedicated to combating demonic threats, specialists who study the nature of chaos to better oppose it. These individuals walk a dangerous path, acquiring knowledge that could itself corrupt, learning techniques that risk damnation, maintaining mental disciplines that strain human capacity. Many fall despite their dedication, their knowledge becoming their downfall, as understanding transforms into sympathy, and sympathy into surrender. And so the hierarchy persists, an eternal structure of damnation extending from the lowest daemonette to Slaanesh itself. Each demon serves its purpose, each contributes to the endless pursuit of excess, each works toward the corruption of all existence into perfect service of the Dark Prince. They whisper in dreams and manifest in nightmares. They appear as salvation and reveal themselves as damnation. They offer everything mortals desire and deliver everything they fear. They are beautiful and terrible, seductive and horrifying, the deadliest servants of the youngest chaos god. This is the hierarchy of Slaanesh, an army of corruption, a legion of temptation, an endless tide of excess given form and purpose. They hunt across the galaxy, patient in their pursuit, certain of eventual victory. For in a universe filled with desire and ambition, with the hunger for perfection and the craving for sensation, Slaanesh's servants will always find willing victims, always discover new souls to claim, always advance their god's eternal purposes. And so our journey through the realm of Slaanesh comes to its close. We have walked among the corrupted, traced the birth of a god, examined the ruins of empire, and catalogued the hierarchy of damnation. We have glimpsed horrors that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional history, in realms where mythology and reality merge into singular, terrible truth. But remember, you are safe. These are stories from a fictional universe, dark fantasies created to explore the consequences of excess taken to absolute extremes. The demons we have discussed do not lurk in your shadows. The God whose birth we chronicled will not claim your soul. The corruptions we examined cannot touch you. You lie comfortable and secure, far removed from the grim darkness of the far future. Your world operates by different rules, governed by different laws. The terrors of Warhammer 40,000 remain safely contained within their fictional boundaries, unable to reach beyond the pages and screens that give them form. Let these dark visions fade now as sleep approaches. Let the images blur and soften, the horrors diminish into abstraction, the narratives dissolve into formless dreams. You have journeyed far tonight, through realms of terrible beauty and beautiful terror, and now it is time to rest. Perhaps tomorrow you will remember fragments of what we explored together. Perhaps you will wake with vague impressions of fallen empires and corrupted souls. Or perhaps these visions will fade completely, leaving only the comfortable certainty that they were never real, never more than stories told in darkness to ease the transition into sleep. Rest now, knowing that morning will come, that light will return, that the simple comforts of mundane existence await your awakening. The secrets of Slaanesh have been revealed, examined, and can now be released, fading into the peaceful emptiness of dreamless sleep. Good night.